Welcome to Thrive Deeper, the show based on the Thrive Bible reading guides. This is an ongoing conversation about God's Word with Thrive author, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Good morning, Matt.
Morning, Stu.
I'm quite excited about this episode because this book, the book of James, in my early days as a Christian, I was brought up my mum was a Christian, my dad was fairly antagonistic towards it, but I grew up as what I would consider a Christian. We went to church when we could until my dad said we couldn't, and then as I sort of got out into the workforce, my faith started to become really personal to me, and this book really shaped the way I looked at other people. I looked at all the day-to-day practical issues that came to me. And so I've always loved the book of James because I felt like it was a real turning point in terms of my heart towards other people and to recognizing my place in everything.
Yeah.
So I'm quite excited to be talking about this book. Well, first of all, welcome listeners. Great to have you with us. If you're not sure what you're listening to.
It's nice to imagine you.
Yes, that's right. Welcome to Thrive Deeper. It's great to have you with us, and we are going to continue into the book of James. And Matt, probably what many people won't realise, given where this book is placed in our Bibles, this is probably one of the early, if not the first, New Testament book.
Yeah.
And it's a little different to pretty much all the other New Testament books. I was going to use the word proverbial, but probably that's not the right word to use.
Well,
but
it's got a wisdom literature. It's got a wisdom literature flavour about it, certainly.
Yeah. Some things to know about James. James, this is not James, the disciple who was a son of Zebedee, James and John. This is James, Jesus' brother, who probably came to faith, perhaps, we don't really know, but perhaps after Jesus' resurrection. James is the brother of Jesus, and it interests me that all through this he never plays that card. He never kind of puts that hat on and go, and because I'm the brother of Jesus, which is interesting to me. He was the brother of Jesus, and probably, and correct me if I'm wrong here, the first and early leader of the church in Jerusalem, the Christian church in Jerusalem.
And that's quite generally accepted too, even amongst critical scholars, actually, the authorship, James's authorship, is pretty universally attested.
Yeah. And written fairly soon after Christ's resurrection. So if we say that was AD 33, then this was probably written in, they're saying AD 40, early AD 40s.
Yeah.
That's within a decade
that's right.
of Christ's resurrection. So interesting that this is one of the earliest, if not the first, New Testament book that we read. And clearly James brought up in a family where they knew their Old Testament, because it feels like there's a lot of mirroring back to things that we've read in Proverbs. Yeah. And some really practical advice here in a letter written to the dispersed Christian church.
That's right. So mainly to he's got Jewish believers. And it's good to be reminded, Stu, that initially, the Christian church was Jewish, primarily Jewish, actually. And the mission to the Gentiles was reasonably controversial by the time Paul digs in there and is starting to go out to the Gentiles. That's a new thing. But initially, you've got a Jewish church, and he's writing in a very sort of Jewish way to a largely Jewish audience. James was of course, the leader of the early church. There's the famous account in Acts 15 of the Jerusalem Council. James is clearly in charge at that point. And even when Paul in Acts chapter 21, when he goes back to Jerusalem again, James talks about James and the brothers, and James is the one that I think is concerned about this rumor that's going around about Paul, that he's dissed the law of Moses. And James says, listen, there's this rumor going about. Can you just kind of go through this ritual just to sort of prove to everyone that, you're not dissing Moses? And Paul, even though he thinks stuff like that's not necessary, he's willing to go with James and to do that to keep the peace, which he actually doesn't end up keeping the peace. But so James, James is very much, at the center of things, from the start. He is martyred, actually before Paul, in about probably 62.
Yes.
So maybe around 20 years after this letter was written according to
in a pretty horrific way.
Josephus. Yeah, he was thrown off the top of the temple, and then poor guy didn't actually die from that, but apparently he prays for their forgiveness, and then they stone him to death. Anyway, it's pretty gruesome, but he becomes this martyr and modeling this amazing grace.
Yeah, totally. And the letter specifically is written to a church that's really under persecution at this time.
That's right.
The Jewish Christians who are facing a lot of persecution from really within their own ranks, not the Christian ranks, but and being, I guess, tempted to walk away from the faith.
Yeah. One of the things that encourages me as I read through these letters, this is very much the case with the letters of Paul, and it's the case with this letter too. Like, there's clearly lots of problems in this church.
Yeah.
I mean, we tend to sort of idealize the early church. There's, and of course we idealize them because they suffered such persecution, and of course, yes, persecution does have a sort of purifying effect, but these churches are certainly not without their problems.
No.
I mean, when you read, Paul's letter to the Corinthians, and I mean here as well, he's clearly dealing with, bickering and division and all of the standard human stuff that was there.
Yeah.
I just find that, encouraging, because the church is always very, very imperfect, and yet, look what God has done through history, through his church. And there are times where I think these writers would have thought, oh my goodness, are these guys actually going to pull through?
Yeah, totally.
Anyway, so he addresses that at the start, the start of the letter. And, he's encouraging them actually to read off this persecution and these trials, to see that actually as, rather than that something's going wrong, to actually recognize that this is actually a symptom of something going right, actually, because you're stirring stuff up, and actually, therefore, you're like your Savior. This is the same thing happened to Jesus. And so, he says, consider it, well, it's a strange statement, all joy, brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. So, James is looking at this and he's thinking, this is actually not going to work against the church. What's going to work against the church is the internal bickering, the external persecution. You sense James thinking the external persecution is probably actually going to have this. It is probably going to have this purifying effect on the church, and whenever faith has a cost associated with it, it just refines that faith. And I think that's what he sees happening here. And apparently, it looks like their faith needs some refinement.
Well, he goes on and says, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. He's really talking about our faith in the person who we're praying to, rather than our faith in the outcome we want necessarily here. And he talks a bit more about that later on, but
I think our view when we read off the word of faith, I mean our context is somewhat marred by sort of decades of the sort of positive thinking movement.
Yes, that's right.
And now, which is that's almost sort of in this whole thing about manifesting, focus on the thing that you want and you hold on to it and you just believe that it's going to happen and then it will happen. And unfortunately that has been seen as faith. As faith.
Yep.
And, that's in the sort of what's known as the word of faith movement. And that was sort of rooted in that kind of Norman Vincent Peale sort of tradition of, the power of positive thinking, which actually is rooted in the Christian Science movement, which is a sort of Christian cult from, sort of I think late 19th century, Mary Baker Eddy and all of that sort of stuff. So, it's enormously problematic, and it has affected the Christian tradition. It's sort of come in, through sort of people like Kenneth Copeland and others have sort of brought that into mainstream, although that they would, I think most people would see those guys as real outliers even now. But so I think it's important to recognize that that the faith and the not doubting here, as you say, is not faith in a thing. It's not holding on to the thing that we are having faith for. It's actually holding on to the God in whom our faith is.
In whom we trust.
That's right. It's the confidence. And in a sense, faith is this confidence. It's not, it's a commitment and a confidence in the one that we're committed to. And the problem with the wavering of that is it's essentially doubting something about God. Yeah. That's why this is problematic.
Yeah. Which is what happened right at the beginning. Did God really say that?
Yeah, that's right.
We'll move on to verse 9 now, and there's some really great advice there around our language, about listening, being slow to speak. I mean, that was the stuff that really impacted me. I think I was a young person who thought I knew it all. Man, that really impacted me to the point where, I actually consciously made the decision to stop and listen before I had something to say.
Yeah, we can, as a culture, I think we can be very theoretical. We can be inclined towards theory and belief, as in a set of beliefs, and have a sort of intellectualize faith, because we're very much an information sort of culture. Now, the interesting thing here in the context of who he's writing to, I mean, he's writing to Jewish people that would have been quite well versed. They would have known a lot in terms of scripture. And that would have been seen as a mark of piety, that, you memorize, great slabs of scripture, and you sort of understand the law. You know how it all works, and
in a sense that made you.
And he's saying, look, come on, it's the doing of it, not like don't be too self-impressed by the fact that you know all of these things. In fact, the more that you know, the more accountable you are for what you know
and what you do there.
That's right. So that's what he's
and he says,
pointing to there.
For be doers of the word, not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, he points to for the community, the outcome of their communal faith is essentially how they look after each other, and actually particularly the poorest among them as well. And so that's where he says in verse 27, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, to keep oneself unstained from the world. Yeah. So, he's pointing to the two big things in the prophetic tradition. One is holiness, keeping oneself undefiled from the idolatry of the world, and that comes in many different forms. On the one hand, that's a big theme in the prophets, like Isaiah and Jeremiah, and then of course on the other is justice, is the imperative to to care for the poor. And
James was often nicknamed James the Just. I don't know whether that was at the time, but subsequently he's been called James the Just.
Right. Yeah, and this leads into this concern then for the poor, leads to him to address what seems to have been. This is where you start to see perhaps some of the problems that are happening, in the church. And this is a symptom of something good, because what happened in the early church, remember, this is really early days here. It's amazing to think, actually, we're within the first 10 years of the Christian church here. Yeah. And essentially what had happened is that they had gathered people from all classes, essentially. Yes. Now, this has never happened before. I mean, this is actually never anywhere has ever happened, right?
Yes.
So, pretty much anywhere in the world. I know it's a big statement, but the idea of
all men being equal.
Men and women.
Yes.
Different nationalities and different classes. Yes. So slaves with a nobility sitting around a communion table together. That is incredibly revolutionary. But it comes with a whole lot of problems. I mean, it comes with all sorts of problems. I mean, Paul, for example, deals with the problem of food laws, right? Because they're getting together, they're eating together, right? Yeah. And the Jews have got these scruples about certain kinds of foods, and the Gentiles don't care. And so in Romans 14, he's dealing with those sorts of issues. Right. What James is dealing with here is essentially more the classism, is the fact that, you've got the rich people waltzing in their rich clothes and really flaunting it. It's like, we're all the same, but
but I want to sit over there, and those guys can sit over there.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm just going to state my difference. So there's sort of, yes, we'll sit around the table, but it's this inclination in human beings to try to gain a sense of identity from differentiation.
Yeah.
So I'm going to feel good about myself by differentiating myself from you.
Yeah.
And, how we dress and comport ourselves can be part of that.
But James, in a way, is addressing actually the church about them showing. It's like that wealthy person might come in and not expect that, but they're being treated that way.
Yeah.
They're being shown partiality in a sense because of what maybe the church members think they might be able to gain, or the leadership might be able to gain from that person, or just because, in human nature, somehow we are wowed by people who seem to be doing well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I think one of the challenges is that James is trying to say we should be, as you say, treating all equal, but it's much more about character than it is about capacity or skills or wealth or whatever. It's about our character. In other words, does what I say match up with what I do?
Yeah, that's right. So it's actually Paul, isn't it, that deals with the idea of how, adorning yourself and being over the top with that. Yeah, you're right. In this context, the concern more is for how the church responds to people that waltz in with all of the, flaunting the wealth, thinking, oh, wow, this is, let's show particular partiality towards this person, which sort of destroys this very revolutionary kind of expression that they're achieving.
In a contemporary context, though, let me just say this, and I just recently watched dare I say it, YouTube video of a celebrity, giving his testimony, and everyone kind of goes, "Oh, look here," and in a way we still do that, but there's some value in that because of the influence that person might have on other people.
Yeah,
but we got to be careful not to elevate too far, I guess. I mean, where's that balance, I guess, where we're trying to leverage, the influence of someone who people who are outside of the faith might look at and go, man, I can't believe that guy has become I want to hear what he's got to say. Whereas if I said, oh, I'm Stuart Gunn, who you've never heard of, and I want to tell you, it's like, oh, I don't care.
Yeah.
How do we find that balance? Because even when people come into our church, for instance, we get famous footy players or whatever coming into our church, there's a temptation in a sense to leverage that because of, not from a point of view of it making us feel good, but because we know those people carry influence because of who they are. I don't know. How's that?
Yeah, the problem is if the temptation there is then essentially is to almost sort of depersonalize those people and they become sort of object, like a means to an end.
Yeah.
I can leverage, this person can be leveraged for some sort of reason, or even if it's to make me feel, even if it's to make me feel like
I'm important,
good about myself because I don't know, I know this person, or this is the problem in a world, that works off importance by association, that is very opportunistic, that sees people as means to an end. I'm going to be friends with this person because, that might help me in the future. It's sort of something in the bank. I can, so, better to be friends with rich people and poor people. This is all of this kind of worldly way of thinking that sort of leverages relationships for, in opportunistic ways. I think this is the sort of thing that James is trying to guard against. That's not got to be that. Yes, that's the case out there, but in the church, people are people, and we're all fundamentally equal before God.
Yeah,
and actually, in terms of the kingdom of God, a rich person has nothing more to give, really, of worth than the poorest person in the room. And in fact, the poorest person in the room may have a much more heightened awareness. And when I think in our context, poverty, I'm thinking, people have had really kind of rough backgrounds, and often actually I find people in those circumstances have a much more sort of porous recipients of truth.
Yeah.
And that there's a certain kind of hard-won wisdom that they have. It's like a spiritual wisdom and a vitality that I think brings something really amazing to the church. So,
and as Jesus says, it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than pass through the eye of a needle.
Well, he goes on actually to address the worldliness of rich people in chapter 4.
We'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
I just want to
chapter 5.
Come back to one more thing on this, on the celebrity thing. I think the other thing we need to be mindful of as a church, that some of those people who come into our churches, they're actually looking for something different from the world. They don't want to be swamped by everyone who wants their autograph.
That's right.
They just want to be treated like a normal person.
Yeah.
They want to feel like they're a normal person. And so I think, there's an opportunity for us to actually reflect.
And the church should be the place where we just are all humans before God. We're a family, totally. And that's right. No,
moving on to verse 14, and this is a bit of a, this was a bit of a challenging one for me. I remember back at the time where we've got Paul saying, we're saved by faith, by grace alone and faith. And then we've got James here saying, or seemingly saying, but faith without doing something is equally dead.
Yeah. So let's just pick up the context here.
Yeah, great.
So he's still concerned about them putting into practice, putting stuff into practice. Yep. Now, the showing partiality is actually part of that.
Yes.
It's about putting this into practice, right? We've got to live in fundamentally different ways. And so he's continuing with that thought. And so he says in verse 14, "What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him?" And in fact, he goes down in verse 24. He says, this is sort of the summation of what he argues here. He says, "You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone." Now, for a lot of people, this would seem to contradict what Paul says in Romans 3:28, which he says in Romans 3:28, and I quote, "For we maintain that a person is justified by faith apart from works of the law."
Yeah.
So that would seem like a direct contradiction. But actually, the two perspectives are very consistent with each other because they're doing different things, really.
Okay.
And they're dealing with slightly different things. So James is speaking about faith in the sense of what we would refer to as belief, assent, a sort of intellectual assent.
Right.
And his point is, context is everything, Stu.
Yes.
So it flows out of them, the hearing and doing issue. So you hear all of this stuff, you learn all of this great truth, you nod your head to it. Yeah, I believe all of that. Right, that makes me a Christian. No. It's not just sort of memorizing all of this truth and giving the nod to it. I mean, that's sort of part of it. But you know what? Like, even the devil can do that.
And he even says that. Yeah, that's right.
Like the devil acknowledges, goodness, when we went through the Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah.
I mean,
demons.
The clearest confessions of who Jesus was, were coming from demons, right? They knew who he was. So just knowing what is the truth and even believing that it is the truth, because clearly the demons acknowledged and believed that Jesus was the Messiah. That kind of belief doesn't save you. It's actually the trust element in that, which is the active element. Trust is an active thing. So when he's talking about faith, he's talking about faith in that sort of reductionist sense, that faith being reduced to just sort of the intellectual assent. What Paul is dealing with in Romans and Galatians, he's dealing with the question of what counts as the sort of badge of inclusion in the covenant community.
Understanding that Paul was talking to Gentiles who were trying to find a way to belong. And so do we need to be circumcised? Do we need to do this? Do we need to do that?
Well, yes, it's Gentiles under pressure from Jewish people to wear the markers of inclusion in the covenant community, which were, circumcision and the keeping of the various festivals and days and so forth.
Eating the right food.
Eating the right food, or all of those sorts of things, right? Because they were all markers of identity, essentially. So actually the difference in the quotes is important because, James says, a person is justified by works and not by faith alone, whereas Paul says in Romans 3:28, he talks about works of the law.
Yes.
So it's not just by, because James's point is that faith works. Faith works.
If it's genuine faith, it's going to change your heart, which means you are going to do different things.
Because you live, in a sense, you entrust your life. This is why I often, in our culture, when I point to faith or invite people to faith, I often use the phrase, entrust your life to Jesus. Rather than just believe in Jesus like, I believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Yeah. And so suddenly I'm a Christian. It's like, well, that would make the devil a Christian as well.
Yes.
No, it's entrusting your life to Christ, which actually is is a very practical sort of thing.
Yeah.
So James is talking about the fact that faith works. It does something. It trusts in, okay? Whereas Paul is dealing with kind of the works of the law, like, yes, we have the faith that works, but by the way, you also need to tick all of these boxes to be able to wear the badge.
That's great.
That's the thing that Paul is talking about. So I think, because of course we view this through the sort of lens of the Reformation, where this was the big issue, and it's interesting that the pendulum could swing too far to the point where you're saying, no, it's just kind of believing something and your behavior doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and I would say you don't really believe it then. Personally, I would say that, because I think believing something changes your behavior.
Yeah, that's right. Now, it's important to clarify that behaving a certain way does not earn you access to God's favor, right? We have to trust God for forgiveness and for his grace, right? So that's part of entrusting our lives to Jesus, because we also trust him for forgiveness and grace, and as well as the transformation process. What you do doesn't earn you salvation, but the faith that puts you inside the household of grace, as it were, it's essentially you're entering a completely different kind of lifestyle, which includes, by the way, living in grace towards other people. I mean, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So already there, forgiveness is framed within a kind of mutual, it's not only something I receive, I actually now have to do something.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, essentially, I'm saying no to God's grace.
Yeah. And so I think essentially making a decision to follow Jesus is actually the beginning of transformation, of a transformed life. A transformed life is about action.
Yeah,
it's about doing things differently.
Yeah, that's right.
Living
it's a fundamentally different way of living in which your life is entrusted to Christ. So I think that's a really important thing, lest we and James's point, I think, is so important, particularly. Let's just put a line under this. In our day, we can get so caught up with believing all the right things, just trying to dot the I's and cross the T's of all of our beliefs, and then thinking, because I believe all the right things, that's what makes me a Christian. Again, just be reminded, the devil actually believes all the right things, and he's not a Christian. So certainly believing the right things is very important, right? Because one of the things that the devil does do is he wants to twist truth and deceive us, and that has practical effects. But it's actually the life of faith that is the test of whether faith is genuine.
And let's face it, and we'll move on. One of the things I reflected on again back at the time was, if it's just about salvation, then God could take me the minute I make the decision. Why does he leave me here? Because he wants me to be about his mission, which is to witness what it is to live for Christ in this world, so other people come to that place. That only happens if people see my good work.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, and this is a good segue to the next section, because it's actually not just it's not just what I do. It's actually also what my speech is really the core part of this, actually, because speech is such a central part to human identity. It is the core of our humanness, in a sense. We are relational beings. This is what it means, very big part, at least, of what it means to be made in the image of God, according to theologians. This idea that we have these unique relational capacities to relate to God and each other. And language is a capacity that belongs to, because relationships are all about communication.
Yep.
So we are self-communicating beings, right? And we use language, therefore. And so the use of language is a very core part of human identity. We are sort of linguistic beings, in a sense. And so therefore, how you use your language is so, so important. I mean, you think about, this is the theme right from the start. The power of language is a theme right from the start of the Bible. And God said, and it was. And then we're made in the image of God. And so what we say matters. There's a sort of inherent authority in language. You can bless, you can curse. And this is what he's dealing with. Just, it's interesting that he focuses on this as a real core of what it means to live the life of faith. It means to watch out what you say and to use your language in ways that honor God and honor other people, and in ways that bless and not in ways that curse. And this, I think, particularly important given that a big part of our mission actually is talking about Jesus.
Yeah.
And I mean, people used to throw up that quote by, I think it was St. Francis of Assisi, that's, says, preach the gospel all the time, and if necessary, use words. Look, it's great. But the fact is, I mean, St. Francis used a lot of words. He was a preacher. But I think that becomes an excuse. I'll just live a good life and everyone will sort of like me. But I won't mention anything about Jesus because that might flip things a bit. So no, words actually are always necessary.
Yeah. But I think maybe what Francis was, I would hate to
we're not
suggest what he's saying here, but maybe what he was saying is it's one thing to say something, but if it doesn't match your actions, so
no, absolutely, yeah, that's right.
It's like, in a sense, make sure what you're saying actually aligns with what you're doing, and I love the way James really talks about the power of the tongue here, because I think for me, and I'm sure for many of us, we often speak too soon. We say things about people like, I probably shouldn't have said that. The tongue is such a difficult thing to tame if we're going to honor people as sacred human beings loved by Christ. When we get angry with someone, we go and talk to someone else about it, we're dishonoring, and it's such a discipline to kind of not do that. And I think that's, a bit of what James is really trying to address here is that we can give life with what we say.
Absolutely.
We can actually, bring death.
Absolutely. The idea of taming is interesting because it's connected with the idea in Genesis of subduing.
Right.
And I think this idea of subduing our speech and bringing it, in a sense, into order and being measured about how we use our speech and not just mouthing off however we want. There's almost something slightly chaotic and destructive about that. When we looked at the Proverbs, there was a proverb that says, where words are many, sin is not absent. And I've always loved that proverb, and there's the other one, even a fool is considered wise if he keeps his silence. That's not that we should just sit around silently all the time. We absolutely must communicate with each other, but we need to be very, very mindful of the power of our language and the effect that it can have.
Yeah, totally. And I think at the very end of that part of this chapter, he talks about, does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce rings? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. I felt like, to me, he was speaking about, it's one thing to be able to discipline your mind around what you say. It's another thing to question, where did my heart come from that I even thought about saying that? To come back to the source. And I think Jesus spoke about the fact that what we speak from our mouths reflects what we have in our hearts. And so that whole sense of coming back to not just biting your tongue, as we would use the term, but actually going, oh, gee, why am I feeling like I want to say that? And questioning that in our hearts as well.
And what he actually points to is the sort of the solution to this is essentially wisdom. Don't stop speaking, but just exercise wisdom. Let your speech come from a place of wisdom and not from, he talks about boasting and this sort of thing, and just again points them towards wisdom, and that's a very central theme in this book. In fact, he says a bit further on, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask God. He will give you wisdom. If you're willing to to step into that.
Warning against worldliness in chapter 4.
Yeah, this is where he's going for that difference. The point of difference. We've got to be different to people. One of the points of difference is our unity, is the unity of a diverse kind of group of people, and like quarrels and all of this sort of stuff is going to rip this community apart. So essentially he's saying a lot of this comes from, a lot of division actually does come from worldly concerns.
Yeah.
The more we're concerned with us and our identity, all these sort of worldly concerns, the more quarrels there are going to be. But the more, we focus on God's purpose, the more united we're going to be.
And let's remember, this was a church that had early days had given away a lot of their property, shared their property. Then they were going into a famine time, so there was a lot of struggle. Hey, we gave all this stuff away, to help others, and now we're struggling. And you can imagine all that's going on here. And he goes on to say, you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly. To spend it on your passions. You adulterous people. And when he uses the term adulterous, that's a sort of an Old Testament term, I guess. It aligns with idolatry in a sense. It's you're substituting your trust in God for your trust in the world.
And the great antidote to, or an essentially big part of the solution for unity, and this, you see this in Paul's writings as well, is humility. This is Philippians chapter 2. Have the same mind in you that was in Christ Jesus, who did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, And so that's going to be the core to unity. So just realize, this is where he goes on to speak about humility. And in fact, it's interesting because he says, cleanse your hands, you sinners, purify your hearts, you double-minded. Verse 9, Stu, be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. Essentially, what he's pointing to here is be willing to experience the pain of your need and your brokenness. That's like you're actually you're not as good as you think you are, right? And essentially the gateway to salvation is the willingness to allow the sort of anesthetics, the various anesthetics that we use, perhaps cultural or psychological anesthetics that we use to sort of dull the pain of our brokenness. Let yourself feel the pain of your brokenness, because that will drive you to salvation. That becomes the beginning of you accessing the power of God to bring that kind of change. So it's kind of facing reality before you can receive the truth. That's what he's doing. That's what he's doing. It's the principle of Psalm 126. Those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy. So he's not, he's not saying that Christians should be, going around down,
but I think he's kind of saying,
all the time.
Don't exalt yourself. Let it be God who lifts you up and exalts you. Not you trying to pump up your own tires. Be humble, because recognize we're all lost completely without Christ.
This is a verse actually that I've often appealed to. I think particularly for people who feel like being a Christian means that you just got to be happy, like as in jubilant all the time, and that therefore see. Most of the Psalms are, of course, lament Psalms, and say, that's all sort of Old Testament, sort of depressing kind of Old Testament stuff. It's like, no, this is such an important principle of biblical spirituality, is this idea you have to face the harsh realities of ourselves and the world, and in a sense, sow in tears in order to be able to reap with songs of joy, to find in the midst of that and connect with God's solution for that. So it's this constant kind of recognition. It's almost both together. It's being disturbed by the problem enough to rejoice in the solution, and the interplay between those is such a key dynamic of biblical spirituality. Paul says in Romans 8, we who have this first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly. Not like, we have the first fruits of the Spirit, we're just happy all the time. Well, but only because we groan inwardly. And he frames that groaning as that's actually what hope is. Hope is, I don't like this, the way that things are. I don't like the way I am or the way the world is. So I'm putting my hope in God. And so, and he sees hope as it's hope that brings joy. We rejoice in the hope of glory. So this idea of allowing ourselves to feel the sting of our brokenness and the brokenness of the world, and being disturbed and grieved by that, actually is the gateway to joy.
And I think there's two separate things there: being sad and humble in our own brokenness. But Jesus wept. Jesus wept.
Over the world predicament. That's right.
And if we can't look at our world and see the brokenness and the hurt and the pain, and to some degree feel the weight of the sadness of that for God, then we're not really picking up our cross, are we?
That's right. when I was in conversations with Baker Books about publishing my book on the Psalms, my initial preferred title was The Pursuit of Sadness,
which I loved. I remember you and I debating that. They could not cope with that.
They could cope with that.
We love Baker Books, mind you, but never.
Yeah. But I mean, I get it. I think it was just but I mean, my point, I wanted to be countercultural because our culture is so much about the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
And I just think the gateway actually is to enable us to feel our need. That's where Paul starts in Romans. I mean, his exposition of the good news begins with the bad news.
Yeah, that's right.
You need to feel this.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you have no capacity to appreciate what God has done.
The analogy you gave one time in a sermon many years ago, I think, was if you want to get somewhere, let's say to happiness, in Google Maps, let's just say, you've got to know where you're starting from.
Yeah, that's right.
If you don't know where you're starting from,
exactly,
you don't know really where you're heading to. So that whole sense of recognizing where you're at and then looking forward to where God's going to take.
And it's not something that that just happens once back when you.
No, that's right.
When you first get converted. No, because we there's this constant interplay between these things because God is grieved over things in us and in the world. John says if we say we are without sin, we deceive ourselves, right?
Yeah.
So there are things within us that grieve God. There are certainly things in the world that grieve God. So should we not share that grief? Of course we should. Yeah, absolutely. Totally. So, I think that's
I remember just coming back to that. I think we do need to be willing to allow ourselves to weep over the things happening. I remember many years ago watching one of those TV articles around a famine in Africa somewhere, and I had young children at the time, sort of the age of the kids you were seeing on TV, and I literally wept, and I did not know what to do with that grief. And I think that we've got to start feeling that a bit more. We put all this stuff around ourselves to kind of anesthetize ourselves, as you would say, to this stuff, but we've got to learn to grieve at what God grieves at, because that's going to call us to action.
Yeah, that's right.
In this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe into chapter 5.
Yeah.
Warning to the rich.
This is what I was saying before. I mean, he really comes down with a pretty hard kind of warning for the rich people. And I think this is directly connected with, the teaching of Christ and Jesus' warnings actually about the wealthy. There's the famous story of the rich young man, for whom wealth is a real blocker for him. And Jesus says it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom. It's, than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Man, I mean, of course, he goes on to say, look, all things are possible. That's fine, right? God can make that happen. But you need to take the obstacle clearly, because wealth can be such an idol. And so, that's where he says, come now, you rich, because this comes out of essentially what we were saying, because he says, come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten, your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold the wages. He goes on to talk about the injustices.
I think there's
inevitable injustices in hoarding wealth in that sort of culture.
And the context where there were people starving, because, again, they'd given their stuff away. And here's these wealthy people who are just keeping it to themselves, not even, it would seem, paying the wages of people who've done work for them because of greed.
And then being kind of happy. It's like, oh, wow, gee, aren't we so blessed? Isn't this great? And he's saying, no, don't be happy about it. And again, there's this invitation to sort of be slightly disturbed, actually, essentially at their own idolatry. And he's not wiping them off here. No. He's not condemning them here. He's just saying the first step for you is actually to be very personally disturbed at your own idolatry and your propensity to trust in your material wealth. I reckon, Stu, this is, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, totally.
We are the wealthy by world standards. I think we've got to read this as written to us. I think we're going to gain a lot more from that if we assume that, because, man, we are so secure in our wealth, in our culture. So what do we really need to trust God for compared to what people were facing at this time?
Yeah, totally.
With all the safety nets that we have and we've got, honestly, we could easily be alienated from faith in that way. And so I think, this is very sobering for us too. So he comes back to the issue of persecution, and he encourages them, to persevere through that. there will be outcomes, for this. But in the meantime, be patient with each other. Patience, because nothing happens in the kingdom of God quickly. You might be in a bit of a row or a bit of a tension now, and our tendency is wanted to fix things right away.
Yeah, and he refers back to the prophets, who some of them didn't even see what God had promised. Job, who went through all of that, and it was only at the very end that So it's kind of like, hang in there, and it may not be that you see. Just like Moses didn't enter the promised land. It may be that you don't see
that's
what
right.
it is that God's promised, but you need to trust that God is good anyway.
But in the meantime, he points them towards prayer, faithful prayer, confession. He talks about the healing prayer, like if you need healing, go to the elders of the church. He says, confessing your sins to one another. I think this is that's, I think, one of the best things that can happen in a community. I mean, not everyone to everyone, but to have spaces where we can be really vulnerable and honest with others, to create an environment. Too often in church history, the church has become a bit of a sort of self-righteous club where no one wants to admit their faults because I feel like I won't fit in. How do we get to that? The church is meant to be a recovery community.
Yes.
It's a hospital for sinners, right? So it's like, it's like in a drug and alcohol rehab. Someone saying, "Oh, I'm actually an alcoholic," and someone saying, "What? You're what?" And feeling ashamed.
How did you get in here?
Well, that's what the whole point of being. I mean,
totally.
The whole point of being part of a church is that we're in recovery together, right? So we might as well be honest about it. And it's never a smooth journey. It's always up and down. In fact, God allows us to stumble and fall to see the problems that we have, right?
Yes.
So let's talk about it with each other. So I think this confessing one another dynamic that James points to here is so vital as an antidote to the church becoming a sort of self-righteous club.
And let's just be clear on that. It's the right person at the right time, not everyone. We don't stand up the front and announce stuff. We build a relationship with someone that we can trust, and they can trust us perhaps, and we share at the right time in the right place. So.
What a letter, Stu. I over the last couple of weeks, I've been reading through this, and just again this morning as I read this, and I just found there's something so deeply penetrating about this book. And I mean, I specifically read the bit about taming the tongue and what I say and the use of my speech, and this is where letters like this, they can become a mirror if you let them become a mirror. I always think it's safest to assume you do have a problem rather than you don't, because there's much more to gain from that. And there's so much grace for us if we're willing to look in this mirror and see, you know what, I have these problems. We've got to remember, we're in a household of grace, right? It's safe to see that you're wrong. And in fact, it's necessary and vital to see that you're wrong. And there is grace for that, but most of all, there is power for transformation.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Thrive Deeper. Our home on the internet is thrivetoday.tv. You can contact us, ask questions, see all our resources and much more at our website thrivetoday.tv. We really appreciate the questions and thoughts about what you're reading as we go through the Bible with Thrive. Until next time, our prayer is that these shows will inspire you to go deeper and thrive.